On the morning of the 19th of February 1913, the half-built country house of the Chancellor of the Exchequer stood in the silence after the explosion. 2 bombs had been placed in the foundations under cover of darkness. One had detonated. The other had not. David Lloyd George's house at Walton Heath, Surrey, had been chosen, in the words of the woman who would take responsibility for it the next morning, because the Chancellor was the most powerful man in the cabinet and because the cabinet would not listen. Emmeline Pankhurst, 54 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, dressed in black, walked toward the cameras and confessed. If you enjoy stories the history books left half told, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. I am bringing you the rest of her life now, and it is stranger and sadder than the morning at Walton Heath. Chapter 1. The girl her father refused to educate. She was 11 years old when she understood, from a sentence overheard through a bedroom door, that her brothers would be sent to school and she would not. The house was in Pendleton, on the western edge of Manchester, a substantial brick villa attached to the calico print works her father owned. Robert Goulden was a cotton printer and a man of the kind of practical opinions that Manchester in the 1860s manufactured by the thousand. He liked his daughters near him. He read aloud from the works of Charles Dickens after supper. He believed in the abolition of slavery. He had marched in support of the Union during the American Civil War. He was, by any test that would have applied in the city at the time, a progressive father. He still believed his daughters did not need an education. Emmeline was the eldest of 10 surviving children. She would later remember the precise night that the sentence reached her. She had crept out of her bedroom because she heard her father's voice in the corridor. He was leaning over the banister, talking to her mother on the floor below. He said, of his elder daughter, that it was a great pity she had not been born a lad. She did not weep. She wrote, half a century later, that the sentence settled into her like a piece of cold metal pressed into a bruise. She was old enough to know that her own intellect was as good as her brother's intellect. She was old enough to know the door of the school the boys attended would not open to her. What she had not known until that moment was that her father, the most enlightened man she would meet in her childhood, would not so much as wish her into the room. She set herself a program of reading. The Goulden Library was unusually full. She read Thomas Carlyle and John Stuart Mill. She read the early novels of the Bronte sisters. She read parliamentary debates in the back numbers of the Manchester Guardian. When she was 14, her mother took her to a suffrage meeting in the centre of Manchester at the request of the campaigner Lydia Becker. Lydia Becker was 45 years old and had been the founding secretary of the Manchester Society for Women's Suffrage. She stood at the lectern and explained, in plain prose, what the franchise was, why it had been refused to women, and what reasons had been given. None of those reasons stood up. Emmeline returned home a converted girl. She wrote that she had walked into the meeting accepting that women had no political voice. She had walked out understanding that the absence of a voice was a wound, that the wound had been deliberately made, and that the people who had made it were still alive. Her parents sent her at 15 to the École Normale de Neuilly in Paris to finish her schooling. The school was unusually progressive. The headmistress, Mademoiselle Marchef Girard, taught her pupils chemistry and bookkeeping alongside French and the piano. The school was a republic of brilliant girls. Emmeline spent 3 years there. She came home in 1876 with fluent French and a finished sense of who she was. She came home to a city in motion. Manchester, at the close of the 1870s, was the industrial capital of the world and the political capital of British descent. The Free Trade Hall on Peter Street still carried the echo of the Anti-Corn Law League. The cotton famine of the 1860s was a recent memory. The Independent Labour Party was 20 years away from its founding, but the politics that would produce it were already on the streets. She returned to her father's drawing room and asked for the first time who his political friends were. He introduced her a few weeks later to one of his political friends. The friend was a man 24 years older than she was. Chapter 2. The barrister 24 years older. She fell in love with Dr. Richard Marsden Pankhurst because he believed exactly what she believed, exactly as completely as she believed it. Richard was 44 when she met him. She was 20. He was a Manchester barrister, a graduate of London University, the holder of a Doctor of Laws degree from the University of London. He wore a long red beard. He had a high, gentle voice. He was a Republican, a Unitarian, a former parliamentary candidate for Manchester, who had lost on a platform of universal male suffrage, the abolition of the House of Lords, and the disestablishment of the Church of England. His chambers in King Street, Manchester, were small and poorly furnished. His clients were trade unionists and freethinkers, and women trying to recover property from their husbands. He was, in 1979, the only male barrister in Manchester who would draft a will or a separation deed for a married woman in her own name without first obtaining the husband's consent. Emmeline went to his chambers on the afternoon of the 23rd of April, 1879. She wanted to volunteer for the next campaign on the Married Women's Property Bill. He invited her to attend a planning meeting at his house the following Tuesday. She returned. She returned again. 8 months later, she proposed to him a free union without marriage, on the grounds that marriage was an institutional fraud against women. He explained that her future as a political organizer would be destroyed if she lived openly outside marriage, and that she would carry the weight of the disgrace, and he would not. She accepted his reasoning. They were married at St. Luke's Church, Pendleton, on the 18th of December, 1879. They moved to Buckingham Crescent, in the centre of Manchester. Richard worked in his chambers. Emmeline ran a small drapery shop on King Street called Emerson and Company. The shop sold artistic furniture, William Morris fabrics, and ladies' gloves. It lost money steadily. They moved to London in 1886 and took a lease on No. 8 Russell Square in the Bloomsbury district. The lease was beyond their means, and the shop, relocated to 234 Hampstead Road, failed within 3 years. Their first child was Christabel, born on the 22nd of September 1880. Their second was Sylvia, born on the 5th of May 1882. Their third, a son, was Henry Francis, born on the 27th of February 1884. He died of diphtheria at the age of 4. Their fourth was Adela, born on the 19th of June 1885. Their fifth, a second son named Henry Francis, after his dead brother, was born on the 7th of July 1889 and died of paralysis of the spinal cord in 1910 at the age of 20. Through the 1880s, Richard contested 4 parliamentary elections. He fought Stoke-on-Trent in 1885 for the Liberal Party. He fought Rotherhithe in 1886, and Gorton in 1885, and Gorton again in 1895, each time as an independent radical. He lost every contest. Each contest cost him in election expenses, agents' fees, hire of meeting halls, and the cost of printing. By 1893, the cumulative bill ran to almost £1,000, a sum equivalent in modern purchasing power to roughly £120,000. The family budget could not bear it. In Russell Square, the Pankhursts kept a salon. The visitors included James Keir Hardie, the first independent Labour Member of Parliament who became Sylvia's mentor and, in her early 20s, her secret lover. The visitors included George Bernard Shaw and the journalist William Stead. They included Annie Besant and Tom Mann and Eleanor Marx. The drawing room at No. 8 was the second home of the British radical movement in the late Victorian decade. The Liberal Party of William Ewart Gladstone, to which the Pankhursts had attached themselves at the start of the 1880s, refused throughout that decade to support women's suffrage. The Pankhursts left it. They joined the Independent Labour Party at its founding in 1893. Emmeline became a member of the Manchester School Board in 1894 and a poor law guardian in 1895, the only two elected positions in the country at the time that were open to women. In each role, she saw the working class of Manchester at its weakest and its most exposed. The poor law work in particular, the daily encounter with destitute mothers and unsupported children, hardened a conviction in her that the franchise alone could not reform the country, but no other reform was possible until the franchise had been won. By the close of 1897, when Richard was 63, the family was once again in financial difficulty. He had earned almost nothing at the bar for 2 years. His health had begun to fail. He was diagnosed in the spring of 1898 with a duodenal ulcer. He told Emmeline she should take the children for a holiday in Switzerland. She left in the second week of June. She had been in Geneva for 3 weeks when the telegram caught up with her. Chapter 3. The Day That Made Her a Widow. She was in Switzerland for the first holiday of her marriage when the telegram caught up with her. It was the 5th of July, 1898. The telegram had been wired to her hotel in Geneva from the office of Richard's brother in Manchester. The ulcer had perforated in the small hours of the morning. Richard was dead. He was 63 years old. They had been married for 18 years and 7 months. She caught the train from Geneva that night. She travelled through France and across the Channel and arrived in London on the 8th of July. She went directly to the Manchester house and prepared the body of her husband for burial. The funeral was held at the Brookhill Unitarian Chapel in Manchester. The attendance was small. 3 of Richard's former colleagues at the bar, 2 members of the Independent Labour Party, Keir Hardie, a handful of neighbours. The financial position was worse than she had feared. Richard had left debts to the value of approximately £500 and almost no assets. The lease at Russell Square had been surrendered when they had moved back to Manchester in 1893. The Manchester home in Victoria Park was held on a short tenancy. The 4 surviving children were aged 17, 16, 13, and 9. There was no insurance policy. There was no pension. She made a series of decisions in the autumn of 1898 that defined the rest of her life. She refused, in writing, the offer of a public subscription that had been opened by Keir Hardie to support the Pankhurst family. She wrote to him that she would not be made the object of charity. She accepted the offer of an unpaid appointment as Registrar of Births and Deaths for the district of Chawlton on Medlock in Manchester. The registrar role required her to keep an office for the receipt of births, marriages, and deaths from the working class of the district. She moved the family into a smaller house at 62 Nelson Street, Chawlton on Medlock, in 1898. The house cost £28 per year in rent. She fitted out the front parlour as the registrar's office. For 5 years, she kept that office. The working-class women of Manchester came to her doorstep. They came to register a birth or a death. They came to declare a child as illegitimate when the father refused to be named. They came to ask whether the law would protect them from a violent husband. The law would not. They came to ask why the workhouse had separated them from their children. The workhouse was permitted to do so. She did not promise these women that their situation would change soon. She did promise them, in a more general and more dangerous way, that what she had seen in her parlour would not be permitted to continue. In the spring of 1903, she invited a small number of women friends to her parlour at 62 Nelson Street. The date was the 10th of October 1903. The women included her daughter Christabel, now 23 years old, the seamstress Annie Kenny from the Oldham cotton mills, the schoolteacher Hannah Mitchell, and 3 further members of the Independent Labour Party. The room held 7 women. The parlour was about 15 feet square. It had a marble fireplace and a brown carpet and a writing table. Emmeline stood at the writing table. She told the 7 women that the existing suffrage organisations, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the Manchester Society for Women's Suffrage, were respectable and tireless and ineffective. She told them that she proposed a new organisation with a single rule, which was that no man could be a member. She proposed a name: the Women's Social and Political Union. The motto of the union, she said, was deeds, not words. The union would commit itself to the parliamentary franchise for women on the same terms as men. The union would commit itself to use methods that the constitutional movement had refused to use. The union would not accept any longer that defeat was patient work. A vote was taken in the room. The vote was unanimous. The Women's Social and Political Union was founded that night. Emmeline closed the meeting at 9 o'clock. The 7 women left. She washed the cups. She wrote a single line in her diary. The line read, in the firm Edwardian copperplate that the women of her education were trained to write, "Deeds, not words, begun." She did not know that she had given herself 10 years to live as anything other than a public criminal. She did not know that she had founded the only modern political organisation in British history that would burn the country houses of its opponents to win the vote. She knew only that the room had said yes, and the door, when she closed it that night, had closed behind her, on the last quiet evening she would have for a quarter of a century. Chapter 4. The word they refused to say. She believed at the start of 1905 that a private member's bill could solve everything, and at the end of 1905 she did not. The first 2 years of the Women's Social and Political Union were quiet. The union met in members' parlours. It published leaflets. It corresponded with members of Parliament. It tried, in the way every 19th century pressure group had tried, to persuade the House of Commons to grant the franchise by procedural means. The persuasion did not work. In the spring of 1905, the Conservative backbench member for Glasgow Bridgeton, Sir Charles Maclaren, introduced a Women's Enfranchisement Bill. The bill received a first reading. The second reading was scheduled for Friday the 12th of May. The day arrived. The bill was scheduled 4th on the order paper. The first item on the order paper that morning was a bill regulating roadside lighting in rural districts. Members spoke against the roadside lighting bill for the entire morning. They spoke against it for the entire afternoon. They spoke against it through the dinner hour. At 5 minutes to 11 o'clock at night, the roadside lighting bill was still being debated. The Women's Enfranchisement Bill, 4th on the order paper, was not reached. The Commons rose at 11 o'clock. The procedure was called talking out a bill. It had been used dozens of times before against private members' bills. It was used because the government opposed the bill, did not wish to be seen to oppose it, and arranged for sympathetic backbenchers to talk out the offending measure under cover of an irrelevant earlier debate. Emmeline had read about the device. She had not, until the night of the 12th of May, sat in the ladies' gallery of the House of Commons and watched it. She sat in the gallery from the morning. She watched the Commons through the wooden lattice that screened the women's section from the men below. The lattice had been installed in 1834, when the chamber had been rebuilt after the fire. The lattice was the symbol that defined her century. She watched as men who claimed to support her cause failed to challenge the device that was killing it. She watched the speaker. She watched the clock. She watched the bill not reached. She walked out of the gallery at 11 o'clock and stood on the pavement of St. Margaret Street in the May night and made a decision. She told Christabel, who was at the gallery with her, that no further private members' bills would receive the union's support. She would demand a government bill, or she would force the government to demand one. 6 months later, on the 13th of October 1905, the Liberal Party held a major meeting at the Free Trade Hall on Peter Street in Manchester. The Free Trade Hall held 3,000 people. The platform speakers were Sir Edward Grey, who would shortly become Foreign Secretary, and Winston Churchill, then a Liberal member for Oldham. The meeting was the formal opening of the Liberal general election campaign in the North West. Christabel and Annie Kenney bought tickets. They sat in the third row. Christabel had prepared a banner. The banner had been hidden under her coat. The banner read, in plain capital letters of Indian ink on calico, "Will the Liberal government give votes to women?" She held the banner up at the end of Sir Edward Grey's speech and asked the question aloud. Sir Edward did not answer. He went to the next question. Annie Kenney stood and asked the same question. Sir Edward did not answer. Christabel and Annie stood again and asked the same question. The chair of the meeting, John Tillett, tried to silence them. Stewards came to remove them. The crowd shouted at the women. The women refused to sit. Christabel deliberately spat into the face of a steward. She had spent the train journey practicing the act. The two of them were ejected from the Free Trade Hall by police and charged outside on the pavement of Peter Street with technical assault and obstruction. At the magistrate's court the next morning, Christabel demanded the imposition of a prison sentence rather than a fine. The magistrate, Sir John Burrough, offered her the alternative of a fine of 10 shillings. She refused to pay. She was sentenced to 7 days. Annie Kenney refused the fine of 5 shillings and was sentenced to 3 days. They were taken to Strangeways Prison in Manchester. The press coverage was enormous. The Manchester Guardian, the Daily Mail, the Manchester Evening News, the Daily Express, the Times. The story was the same in every paper. 2 women had been imprisoned for asking a question at a public meeting. The shame of the Liberal government and of the Manchester police was instant. The membership of the Women's Social and Political Union rose from a few hundred at the start of October to several thousand by Christmas. The membership of the Constitutional National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies rose only slowly. A pattern had been established. The union would interrupt government meetings. Members would be ejected. Members would refuse to pay the resulting fines. Members would accept prison. The publicity would be massive. The Liberal government, in office from December 1905, with Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman as Prime Minister, and from April 1908, with Herbert Henry Asquith as Prime Minister, became the formal enemy. Emmeline had not thrown the first action herself. Christabel had. But Emmeline had understood, watching her daughter march into the Free Trade Hall with the banner under her coat, that her daughter had taken the family across the line into a new kind of politics. The peaceful years of letter writing and committee meetings were over. The years of agitation had begun. She sold the King Street drapery shop in late 1905. She moved the family permanently to London. She rented offices at 4 Clement's Inn off the Strand. She gave up her registrarship in Manchester. She had been Mrs. Pankhurst, the widow with 4 children and a small office and a small income. She would now be Mrs. Pankhurst, the principal organiser of an insurrectionary political movement. She was 47 years old. Chapter 5. The 500,000 in Hyde Park. On Saturday, the 21st of June 1908, she stood on platform number 5 and saw 250,000 people fall silent for her voice. The Women's Social and Political Union held its first London meeting at Caxton Hall in Westminster on the 19th of February 1906, the night Parliament opened. The hall was full to its capacity of 700. The speakers were Emmeline, Christabel, and Annie Kenny. The meeting passed a resolution declaring war on the government's refusal to grant the franchise. 300 women marched from Caxton Hall to the Houses of Parliament that night and demanded admission. They were turned away. They returned the following week and demanded admission. They were turned away. 11 women were arrested. The union began to acquire what no constitutional body had ever acquired in the suffrage movement: continual, daily, urgent, dramatic news coverage. The London headquarters at 4 Clement's Inn became the operational centre of the movement. Frederick Pethick Lawrence and his wife, Emmeline Pankhurst Lawrence, joined the union in the autumn of 1906. They brought with them a substantial private income from his family's soap manufacturing business and from her work as a social reformer in Camberwell. Mrs. Pankhurst Lawrence became the union's honorary treasurer. The union's income rose from £42 in 1906 to £2,900 in 1907. By 1909, the income would reach £22,000. By the climax year of 1913 and 14, the income would reach £33,000, equivalent in modern purchasing power to roughly £4.5 million. The headquarters at Clement's Inn employed by the end of 1909 more than 50 paid staff. There was a press department under Henrietta Marshall. There was a finance department. There was a literature department under Sylvia. There was a chapters department that handled correspondence with the branches in the provinces. There were 90 branches by 1909. The union's newspaper, Votes for Women, founded in October 1907 and edited by Frederick Pethick Lawrence, achieved a weekly circulation of 40,000 copies within 18 months. The colours of the union, chosen by Mrs. Pethick Lawrence in May 1908, were purple for dignity, white for purity, and green for hope. A merchandise operation was established to sell sashes, ribbons, postcards, and souvenirs in the colours. The London Tea Room at 156 Charing Cross Road, called the Women's Press Shop, served as a public meeting point. The political year of 1907 proved the worth of the model. The union had 2 principal weapons. The first was the by-election deputation. Whenever a parliamentary by-election was called, organisers from Clement's Inn descended on the constituency. They campaigned against the Liberal candidate, regardless of his views on the franchise, on the principle that the Liberal Party as a whole was responsible for the government's refusal to grant a measure. The campaigns were successful at the polls in the sense that several Liberal candidates lost narrow seats to Conservative challengers in 1907, although it cannot be proven the loss of votes was decisive. The second weapon was the deputation to the House of Commons. The deputation was a procession of women, led by Mrs. Pankhurst herself, that walked from Caxton Hall to the members' lobby, demanding the Prime Minister receive them. The Prime Minister never received them. Mrs. Pankhurst was arrested on the deputation of the 11th of February 1908 outside the gates of the Strangers' Entrance and sentenced to 6 weeks in Holloway prison. The sentence was her first. In Holloway, she was placed at her own demand in the 2nd Division, the category for political prisoners. She was held in cell A234. She slept on a plank bed. She read a Bible and a copy of The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. She lost a stone in weight. She emerged at the end of March 1908 to a reception of 2,000 women at Eustace Miles Restaurant on Charing Cross Road. The peak of the year was Sunday, the 21st of June 1908. The union staged Women's Sunday in Hyde Park. The day had been planned for 9 months. 20 special trains had been chartered from the provinces. 6 processions assembled at 6 points across central London. 30,000 women marched in white dresses with sashes in the Union colours from the embankment at Charing Cross, from Paddington Station, from Marble Arch, from Trafalgar Square, from the Embankment at Westminster, and from Euston Station. Each procession converged on Hyde Park between 3:30 and 4:30 in the afternoon. 7 platforms were arranged across the park. Mrs. Pankhurst spoke from platform number 5 at 4:30. The crowd was the largest political assembly London had ever seen up to that date. The Daily Express estimated 500,000. The Times estimated 250,000. The Manchester Guardian estimated 300,000. The Metropolitan Police estimated 200,000 and refused to revise the figure upward. From the photographs that survive, taken from the upper windows of buildings on Park Lane, the crowd appears to fill the entire park from Hyde Park Corner to the Serpentine. She spoke for 27 minutes. She spoke without notes. She did not raise her voice. The recorder of the Manchester Guardian, sitting at the foot of platform number 5, recorded her words in shorthand. She told the crowd that the day proved that the country wanted the franchise for women, that the government had no remaining moral argument against the franchise, and that the government would refuse it nonetheless. She told them that the refusal would be answered. She did not say how. The morning newspapers of Monday, the 22nd of June 1908, reported that the largest political demonstration in British history had taken place. The Liberal cabinet met the following Tuesday. The cabinet did nothing. Herbert Henry Asquith, the Prime Minister, told a delegation of Liberal members of Parliament that the demonstration had not changed his mind. The demonstration had proven the depth of public support. The demonstration had not produced a single inch of legislative movement. Mrs. Pankhurst understood the lesson immediately. The largest peaceful demonstration in British history had been ignored. The largest peaceful demonstration in British history could be ignored. The cause would not be won by the demonstration of public support alone. The cause would have to be won by making the cost of refusal greater than the cost of consent. She did not yet know how she would impose the cost. She knew that the moment when she would discover it could no longer be far away. Chapter 6. The Day. The police were allowed to win. The 18th of November 1910 was the day Mrs. Pankhurst stopped believing that Parliament would ever vote without being made to. The 2 general elections of 1910, in January and December, had returned Liberal governments without overall majorities. Herbert Henry Asquith was dependent on the Irish nationalists and the Labour Party for his Commons majority. The constitutional crisis over the People's Budget of 1909, which had been rejected by the House of Lords and which led to the Parliament Act of 1911, dominated the political year. The franchise question was, in Asquith's mind, a distraction from the more important business of breaking the Lords' veto. The first conciliation bill was a private member's measure introduced in the summer of 1910 by a conciliation committee of 54 members of Parliament from all parties. The committee was chaired by the Earl of Lytton, the brother of the suffragist Lady Constance Lytton. The bill had been carefully drafted to extend the franchise only to women householders, approximately 1 million women, on the same terms as the existing male householder franchise. The bill received its second reading on the 12th of July 1910 and passed by a majority of 110. The bill was then referred not to a committee of the whole House, but to a standing committee. The procedural choice was made by the Prime Minister himself. The choice killed the bill, because a standing committee could be denied parliamentary time without political damage. In November 1910, Asquith announced a dissolution of Parliament and a general election for December. The Conciliation Bill, undebated in its standing committee, was killed by the dissolution. The cause was sent back to the start. Mrs. Pankhurst summoned a deputation of 300 women to assemble at Caxton Hall on Friday the 18th of November to demand a meeting with the Prime Minister. The deputation set off at 1:30 in the afternoon. The deputation marched in groups of 12 at a time, the women linked arm in arm, the leaders carrying small Union banners. The destination was the public entrance to the Houses of Parliament at St. Stephen's Hall. The Metropolitan Police had been instructed by the Home Secretary Winston Churchill that no arrests were to be made, and that the women were to be turned back by force. The instruction was given in the belief that arrests would create martyrs, and the use of force without arrests would discourage future demonstrations. The instruction was wrong. The force without arrests produced a 6-hour incident on Parliament Square that became known to the suffrage movement as Black Friday. Constables of the Metropolitan Police, joined by special constables, broke the deputation up by physical force. Women were knocked to the ground. Women were thrown into the road in front of motor buses. Women were dragged by their hair. The Manchester Guardian correspondent recorded that he saw a woman bent backward over the knee of a constable and her arm twisted until she screamed. Crowds of unattached men gathered on the pavements. The men joined in. The Daily Mirror photographer Frederick Charles Pomeroy took a photograph of Ada Wright lying on the pavement with her hat off, blood on her face, and a constable standing above her. The photograph appeared on the front page of the Daily Mirror on the morning of the 19th of November. The cabinet attempted to suppress the print run. The suppression failed. Of the 300 women who marched, 115 later submitted formal complaints of sexual assault. Many of the assaults were committed by the special constables, men of no police training drawn from the public to reinforce the regulars. 2 women died over the following weeks of injuries sustained in the day. A third woman, Cecilia Haigh, died on the 18th of December 1911 of injuries sustained on Black Friday after 13 months of illness. A total of 280 arrests were eventually made, including Mrs. Pankhurst, on the ground that her deputation had constituted an unlawful assembly. Mrs. Pankhurst was charged. The charges against all the women were withdrawn the following morning at the personal direction of Winston Churchill. The withdrawal was intended to bury the day. It did not bury the day. The Conciliation Committee documented the assaults and published a memorandum on the treatment of the women's deputation by the police in February 1911. The memorandum named 29 of the constables involved. The Home Office refused to disciplinary action. Mrs. Pankhurst sat in her flat on Saturday the 19th of November and read the memorandum's first draft, which the Conciliation Committee had sent her. She wrote in her diary that night that she had seen the police state in operation against women in the streets of the capital, that no procedural device or peaceful demonstration would alter the principle she had seen at work that day, and that the time for the constitutional method had ended. 2 further conciliation bills were introduced and defeated in 1911 and 1912. The Union conducted intermittent stone-throwing campaigns against government buildings throughout 1911 and 1912 to protest the defeats. In late November 1912, Christabel summoned her mother to Boulogne-sur-Mer in northern France for a private meeting. Christabel, then 22, and operating from the continent to evade an outstanding warrant against her, was the most senior strategic mind in the Union. The meeting took place over 3 days at a small hotel on the Quai Gambetta. Mother and daughter agreed in Boulogne that the next phase of the campaign would be the deliberate destruction of property belonging to the political class. The targets would include the unoccupied country houses of cabinet ministers. The targets would include sporting pavilions, telegraph lines, post boxes, and the buildings of any institution that publicly opposed the franchise. The aim was no longer to demonstrate support. The aim was to make the cost of refusal greater than the cost of consent. Mrs. Pankhurst returned to London on the 2nd of December 1912. on the 17th of October 1912, she had given a public lecture at the Royal Albert Hall, in which she had declared, in a sentence reported across the next morning's newspapers, "I incite this meeting to rebellion." That sentence had been the public preparation. The Boulogne agreement was the operational decision. The campaign of fire was about to begin. Chapter 7. The country houses began to burn. She did not light the bomb at Walton Heath, but she took responsibility for it in the courtroom because she would not allow her followers to bear the weight alone. The arson and bombing campaign of 1913 and 1914 is the most difficult chapter of Mrs. Pankhurst's life to narrate honestly. It was a campaign of property destruction. It targeted the country houses, the sporting pavilions, the historic churches, the railway carriages, and the public buildings of an entire political class. The targets were chosen for symbolic and strategic effect. The damage was estimated by the insurance industry of 1914 at a total of approximately £70,000 in 1913 and a further £150,000 in the first 8 months of 1914, equivalent in modern purchasing power to roughly £27 million taken together. The number of confirmed attacks was 347 over the 18 months. No civilian was killed. No civilian was permanently injured. The attacks were planned for empty premises, undertaken at night, and accompanied where possible by leaflets identifying the responsible cell. The first bomb attack on a cabinet minister's country house was the bombing of the partially built house of David Lloyd George at Walton Heath in Surrey at 5 o'clock on the morning of the 19th of February 1913. Lloyd George was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The house had been under construction since the autumn of 1912. The architects were Sir Edwin Cooper and Russell Squire. The house was a substantial 7-bedroom Edwardian villa on a 5-acre site adjoining the Walton Heath Golf Club. 2 bombs had been placed in the foundations during the night. The first bomb detonated and caused approximately £500 of damage to the unfinished west wing. The second bomb failed to detonate and was recovered by the police later in the day. The attack had been carried out by 3 women, including Mrs. Edith New and Mrs. Sarah Bennett. The names did not appear in the public record at the time. The cell discipline of the campaign was sufficient that the 3 women who placed the bombs were never identified, prosecuted, or named. The morning after the bombing, Mrs. Pankhurst gave a speech in Cardiff. She told the audience that she accepted personal responsibility for what had happened at Walton Heath, that she had incited her followers to such acts, and that she would do so again if the cause required it. She had not lit the bomb. She had not been at Walton Heath. The legal doctrine of incitement, however, made any speaker who openly accepted responsibility for an act of property destruction liable to prosecution for that act. The Cardiff speech was the deliberate offering of her own person. She was arrested at her flat in Pinner the following Monday morning, the 24th of February, 1913. She was charged at Bow Street Magistrates' Court with procuring and inciting the commission of a felony, namely the bombing at Walton Heath, and was committed for trial at the Central Criminal Court of Old Bailey. Her trial opened on the 2nd of April 1913 before Mr. Justice Charles Lush. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs. The court sitting was held in the largest of the Old Bailey rooms and was packed to its capacity of 300. The trial lasted 3 days. She conducted her own defence. She called as a witness Dr. Catherine Pine, her personal physician, who testified to her health. She called Reverend Conrad Noel, the Anglican priest of Thaxted, who testified to the moral character of the cause. She closed her own defence on the 3rd day with an address to the jury that lasted 93 minutes. The address described, in plain prose, The parliamentary procedural devices that had defeated 3 conciliation bills, the violence of Black Friday, the indifference of the Liberal cabinet, and the impossibility of constitutional progress. The jury withdrew on the 3rd day at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They returned a verdict at 25 minutes past 5. The verdict was guilty on the count of incitement. The jury added a rider recommending the prisoner to the mercy of the court on the grounds of the political nature of the offence. Mr. Justice Lush ignored the rider. He sentenced Mrs. Pankhurst to 3 years penal servitude. The phrase penal servitude carried, in Edwardian usage, an explicit weight. It meant not the 2nd division reserved for political prisoners, but the 1st division reserved for serious criminal offences. It meant hard labour. It meant the loss of personal possessions on entry to the prison. It meant the prison uniform. It meant the consumption of the standard prison diet without supplementary food. The sentence, for a 54-year-old widow with no prior criminal conviction, was extraordinary. The court adjourned. Mrs. Pankhurst was returned to Holloway prison. She refused food from the moment the cell door closed behind her. She had decided in the days before the trial that any custodial sentence would be met with a hunger strike. She had decided that she would not, in this trial or any subsequent trial, accept the food of a liberal prison. The Cat and Mouse Act, the Prisoner's Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act, was given the royal assent on the 25th of April 1913, 3 weeks after her sentence. The Home Secretary, Reginald McKenna, had drafted it precisely to deal with her. The Act permitted the Home Secretary to release on licence any prisoner whose health was endangered by hunger strike. The licence was valid for a fixed period of weeks. The Home Secretary could rearrest the prisoner at any time once health had been recovered. The Act was designed, in McKenna's own private words to the Cabinet, to break the political force of the hunger strike by the simple device of refusing to allow any hunger striker to die in custody. Mrs. Pankhurst was the first prisoner released under the Cat and Mouse Act. She was released on the 2nd of May 1913 on a 15-day licence to a private nursing home at 13 Pembridge Gardens, Notting Hill. She refused to eat at the nursing home. She refused water. She was rearrested on the 17th of May. She was released again on the 3rd of June. She was rearrested on the 14th. She was released again on the 24th. By the end of 1913, she had been released and rearrested 12 times. The attacks continued throughout. The Tea Pavilion at Kew Gardens was burned on the 20th of February. St. Catherine's Church at Hatcham was burned on the 6th of May. The Carnegie Library at Birmingham was attacked. A bomb damaged the throne in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 8th of May 1914. A bomb damaged the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey on the 11th of June 1914. Mary Richardson slashed the Rokeby Venus by Diego Velázquez at the National Gallery on the 10th of March 1914 with 7 strokes of a meat cleaver. Mary Wood slashed the John Singer Sargent portrait of Henry James at the Royal Academy on the 4th of May 1914. Country houses burned. The names of the great families whose properties were attacked or threatened in the campaign of 1913 and 1914, read like a list of the Edwardian political elite. The Wargrave Manor of the Cabinet Minister, Walter Hume Long. The Roughwood Park residence of the financier Sir Cecil Chubb, the Whitechurch House of the Bishop of Salisbury, the unfinished Chequers Court of the Cabinet Minister Arthur Hamilton Lee, the Brent House at Sevenoaks, the mansion of the Liberal Whip at Surbiton, the lost grandeur question. The question this video exists to answer takes its shape from those 18 months. The English country house, the visible body of the political nation since the Restoration, had been sacrosanct. It had been protected by social respect, by the deference of the lower classes, by the universally understood right of the propertied to undisturbed sleep. In 1913 and 1914, in the small hours of 100 nights, the country house could be visited by women carrying paraffin and candle stubs and could be set on fire. Mrs. Pankhurst had broken the sacredness of the property. She had not damaged the buildings in any decisive material way. She had damaged the assumption that the buildings were untouchable. Chapter 8. The Body. As the battlefield. She weighed less than 7 stone when the prison doctor told her she was too weak to be released safely, and she ordered the gate opened anyway. The hunger strike, as a political weapon, had not been invented by the suffragettes. It was older. The Russian revolutionaries of the 1890s had used it. The Irish Republican prisoners would use it. The suffragettes adopted it in 1909 when Marion Wallace Dunlop, sentenced for stenciling a quotation from the Bill of Rights on the wall of St. Stephen's Hall in the House of Commons, refused food on the 2nd of July 1909 and was released on the 8th. Forcible feeding began in late September 1909. The procedure was administered to suffragette prisoners by the prison medical officers of Holloway and other prisons. The prisoner was held in a chair by 4 wardresses. A rubber tube was forced through the nose or down the throat into the stomach. Liquid food, usually a mixture of milk, brandy, and beaten egg, was poured down the tube. The procedure was painful, dangerous, and humiliating. Several prisoners were permanently injured by the device. One prisoner, Lillian Lenton, contracted pleurisy from the inhalation of food into her lungs during a forced feeding in February 1913. Mrs. Pankhurst, on entering Holloway in October 1908 for her first prison sentence, made it known to the prison authorities that she would not submit to forced feeding. She would instead refuse food, refuse water, and accept the consequences. She had decided that no Liberal government would face the political consequences of her death in custody. Her assessment was correct. She was force-fed twice in March and April 1912, after her conviction for window smashing in March of that year. After the second forcible feeding, she swore in her cell, with her hands on a New Testament passed to her by a wardress, that she would resist the next attempt with whatever force was required. She told the prison governor that she would tear the throat of the next medical officer who approached her with the tube. Reginald McKenna, the Home Secretary, accepted the message. He instructed Holloway to release Mrs. Pankhurst rather than attempt a third forcible feeding. The decision was confirmed in writing in Cabinet Papers of the 19th of April 1912. The Cat and Mouse Act of April 1913 formalised the policy. The Act was the Liberal government's procedural solution to the political danger of a suffragette dying in custody. The Act was used against many prisoners. It was used against Mrs. Pankhurst more often and more visibly than against any other. The arithmetic of her use of her own body in 1913 is severe. She was released and rearrested 12 times between the 2nd of May and the 18th of December. She undertook 10 hunger strikes. She undertook 5 thirst strikes, the refusal of liquid as well as food, a more dangerous practice. Her medical reports survive. They show a continual cycle of admission, weight loss, dangerous dehydration, release, slow recovery, and rearrest. Her weight, recorded on entry to Holloway in May 1913 at 9 stone 3 pounds, fell during the year to a recorded low of 6 stone 11 pounds. Her hair turned white during the year. She suffered chronic gastritis, anemia, and what her physician Dr. Catherine Pine diagnosed in November 1913 as a tubercular lesion of the right lung. A bodyguard was formed in late 1913 to defend her from rearrest. The bodyguard consisted of approximately 30 women who had received training in jiu-jitsu from the suffragette martial artist Edith Garrod at her dojo at 9 Argyle Place off Regent Street. The bodyguard was formally constituted on the 30th of December 1913 under the command of Gertrude Harding and Catherine Willoughby Marshall. The bodyguard carried Indian clubs concealed in their muffs. The members wore plain dark suits and broad-brimmed hats. They were not uniformed. They were not publicly identified. The chemist's mortar and pestle that Mary Richardson had used to grind a small explosive charge was kept in the bodyguard's safe house at Lincoln's Inn. The most famous engagement of the bodyguard was at St Andrew's Hall, Glasgow, on the evening of the 9th of March, 1914. Mrs. Pankhurst was advertised to speak. The Glasgow Constabulary had been instructed to arrest her under the Cat and Mouse Act on her arrival at the hall. The bodyguard formed a defensive ring around her on the platform. Approximately 50 Glasgow officers attempted to take the platform. Flower pots full of nails were thrown into the audience as decoys. The bodyguard struck out with Indian clubs. The platform was held for several minutes. The police eventually broke through the ring and took Mrs. Pankhurst by force. She was beaten with police truncheons during her removal. The Glasgow incident was reported across the morning newspapers of the 10th of March as a police riot. The Liberal member for Glasgow Tradeston, Charles Scott Dixon, raised the matter in the House of Commons. The Home Secretary refused to investigate. The cumulative effect on Mrs. Pankhurst's body was severe. Photographs of her in the spring of 1914 show a wasted woman of 55. She walked with a stick. She slept badly. Her teeth had loosened during the hunger strikes. She had lost most of her hearing in the right ear. She had lost the strength of her grip. Dr. Catherine Pine wrote a report in May 1914, concluding that any further imprisonment was likely to be fatal. She forwarded the report to the Home Office. McKenna ordered the next rearrest to be undertaken nonetheless. She continued to speak in public. She gave a speech at the Pavilion Theatre, Mile End, on the 8th of June 1914, which was her last public address before the war. She told the audience that she did not expect to live to see the franchise. She told them that the franchise would come anyway. She told them that she did not care who took the credit, so long as the door of the building of the British Constitution, was opened. She was rearrested on her way out of the theatre and returned to Holloway. She was released 8 days later under the Cat and Mouse Act. She was at her London flat, in the care of her physician, when the news arrived that Britain had declared war on Germany. Chapter 9. The daughter she would never speak to again. The expulsion of Sylvia from the movement took 7 minutes, and Mrs. Pankhurst did not speak her daughter's name again. The price of the campaign was paid in the body of Mrs. Pankhurst, in the country houses of the English elite, and in the relationships of the Pankhurst family. The third cost was, of all three, the one she had not foreseen, and the one she found hardest to defend. The first major expulsion took place in October 1912. Frederick and Emmeline Pankhurst Lawrence had been the financial brain of the Union since 1906. He was the editor of Votes for Women. She was the treasurer. They had financed several of the early actions out of their own pocket. The Pankhurst Lawrences had been the steady moral influence on Christabel since the start. They had counselled against the move from peaceful demonstration to property destruction at every internal meeting of the inner circle in the summer of 1912. After the Cabinet Country House arson decision was taken at Boulogne in November 1912, Christabel resolved that the Pankhurst Lawrences would be removed from the Union. The decision was approved by her mother. The Pankhurst Lawrences were summoned to a meeting at 4 Clement's Inn on the night of the 17th of October 1912. The same day Mrs. Pankhurst delivered her Royal Albert Hall speech declaring the campaign of insurrection. The meeting was brief. Christabel informed the Pankhurst Lawrences that they were no longer welcome in the Union. The Pethick Lawrences asked for an explanation. Christabel declined to provide one. Mrs. Pankhurst, present at the meeting in silence, did not intervene. The Pethick Lawrences left the building. They retained the title Votes for Women, which they had founded and edited, and continued to publish the newspaper independently. The union founded a new internal newspaper called the Suffragette, edited by Christabel from Paris. The Pethick Lawrences continued to support women's suffrage from the outside of the WSPU. Frederick Pethick Lawrence served as Secretary of State for India in Clement Attlee's Labour government in 1945. Neither spoke a public word against Mrs. Pankhurst in the remaining years of her life. The expulsion of Adela followed in the spring of 1914. Adela, the third Pankhurst daughter, was 28 and the least known of the four siblings. She had worked as a teacher and a union organiser since 1907. She had served 3 prison sentences. She had spoken at over 70 public meetings. She had also, by 1913, developed a public position that the cause of suffrage could not be separated from the cause of working-class economic reform. Her position aligned closely with that of Sylvia. Mrs. Pankhurst summoned Adela to her flat in Pinner in February 1914. She offered Adela £20 and a one-way ticket to Australia. She told Adela that she could no longer serve the Union and that she could not stay in England. Adela accepted the £20 and the ticket. She sailed for Australia on the 7th of February 1914 on the steamship Geelong. She arrived in Melbourne on the 2nd of April. She did not return to England in her mother's lifetime. She did not see her mother again at all. The third and most public expulsion was of Sylvia. Sylvia had been working in the East End of London since 1912. She had founded the East London Federation of the Suffragettes, an autonomous WSPU branch based at 321 Bow Road that operated as an essentially independent organisation. The East London Federation accepted men as members. The East London Federation was formally affiliated with the Labour Party. The East London Federation was operating, by 1914, a free milk depot for malnourished children, a free legal advice clinic, and a network of working-class women's clubs. In January 1914, Sylvia announced she would speak at a Free Speech Defence Committee rally at the Royal Albert Hall on the day after a Trafalgar Square Labour Party meeting. The Royal Albert Hall meeting was to be jointly organised with the Labour Party. The platform would include the Labour leader, George Lansbury. Mrs. Pankhurst and Christabel determined that the joint platform with the Labour Party was a violation of the WSPU rule that the union acted independently of all male political organisations. Sylvia was summoned to Paris on the 27th of January 1914. She arrived at Christabel's apartment on the Avenue de la Grande Armée on the 28th. Mrs. Pankhurst was present. Christabel conducted the meeting. Christabel told Sylvia that the East London Federation was no longer a branch of the WSPU. She told Sylvia that the East London Federation would have to operate under a different name from that day forward. She told Sylvia that the alliance with the Labour Party was unacceptable. Sylvia attempted to defend her work. Christabel said, in a sentence Sylvia remembered 50 years later in her memoir, The Suffragette Movement, "You have your own ideas. We do not want that. We want all our women to take their instructions and walk in step like an army." The meeting lasted, by Sylvia's recollection, exactly 7 minutes. Mrs. Pankhurst sat throughout in a chair by the window. She did not speak during the meeting. She did not intervene. When Sylvia rose to leave, her mother rose with her. Sylvia walked to the door. Her mother walked her to the door. They embraced at the threshold. Mrs. Pankhurst said, in the only sentence she spoke to her daughter in the entire interview, "I am sorry it has come to this." Sylvia returned to London. She renamed her organisation the East London Federation of Suffragettes. she continued her work. She lived in voluntary poverty in a small house at 28 Old Ford Road, Boulogne. She maintained the milk depot, the legal clinic, and the network of women's clubs throughout the First World War. She bore a son named Richard Keir Pethick Pankhurst in 1927 without marrying his father, the Italian anarchist Silvio Corio. Mrs. Pankhurst, when she heard of the birth, told her sister that she was disgusted and would not acknowledge the child. She did not. The breach between mother and daughter ran along the central question that the union had never resolved. Was the franchise an end in itself, or was it a means to other reforms? Sylvia believed the franchise was a means. Mrs. Pankhurst and Christabel believed the franchise was an end. The end justified, in their view, the breaking of the means. In the same months, the union's general organisation began to decay. Membership did not grow. Several local branches dissolved. The reading public had begun to weary of the campaign. The newspapers that had been the original engine of the union's growth had become the engines of its denunciation. The Daily Express began to refer to the suffragettes as she-men. The Times suggested in a leader of the 3rd of June 1914 that the cause had been disgraced by its leaders. On the 4th of August 1914, at 11 o'clock at night, Britain declared war on Germany. Mrs. Pankhurst, the next morning, in a single instruction wired from her flat to Clement's Inn, suspended the militant campaign of the Women's Social and Political Union. The country was at war. The cause would wait. Chapter 10. The Most Surprising Patriot. In Britain, she had spent 11 years declaring the British state her enemy, and on the 5th of August 1914, she became its loudest recruiter. The pivot to war service surprised most observers. The union's papers had carried a strain of pacifist sympathy throughout the suffrage campaign. Sylvia and the East London Federation were public pacifists. Many of the rank and file members of the WSPU were members of the Independent Labour Party, which opposed the war from its declaration. Mrs. Pankhurst's own writings had carried a strong anti-militarist note in the years before 1914. The change was complete by the autumn of 1914. Mrs. Pankhurst attended a meeting at the London Pavilion on the 8th of September 1914. She told the audience that the cause of women's suffrage was now identical with the cause of the British nation, that the British nation was at war for civilised values, and that no further militant action could be undertaken until the war was won. The Liberal government had announced an amnesty for all suffragette prisoners on the 10th of August. The prisoners were released. The campaign was over. Mrs. Pankhurst threw herself into recruitment. She spoke at Trafalgar Square, at the Albert Hall, at the Manchester Free Trade Hall. She advocated conscription before the government adopted it. She supported the Order of the White Feather, the campaign by which women presented white feathers as a symbol of cowardice to men in civilian clothes during the war. She undertook a national tour of munitions factories to encourage the recruitment of women into war work. She travelled to the United States, to Russia, and to France in 1915 and 1916 to lecture in support of the Allied cause. The Union's newspaper, the Suffragette, was renamed Britannia in October 1915. Its tone became, in the years of the war, fiercely nationalist. It demanded the internment of all persons of German origin. It demanded the dismissal of the Foreign Office's Sir Edward Grey on the ground that he had not prosecuted the war with sufficient ruthlessness. It demanded a more aggressive blockade of the Central Powers. The newspaper was, by 1917, the most jingoist publication of the Edwardian feminist movement. The political consequence of the pivot was the partial granting of the franchise. The representation of the People Bill was drafted by Asquith's coalition government in the autumn of 1916, primarily to enfranchise the soldier classes who had served in the war, but who, under the old residential qualification, had lost their votes through wartime absence. In the committee stage of the bill, in March 1917, the Speakers' Conference recommended the extension of the franchise to women over the age of 30 who were householders or married to householders. Mrs. Pankhurst told of the recommendation by the Speaker himself in a private interview on the morning of the recommendation, accepted the partial measure. She accepted it because the government would not pass a fuller measure. She accepted it because the cause had become, in the unique circumstances of 1917, capable of being settled. She accepted it because she was 60 years old and her time was no longer infinite. The bill received the royal assent on the 6th of February 1918. 8.4 million women became eligible to vote in the general election to be held later that year. Mrs. Pankhurst voted, for the first time, on the 14th of December 1918. She voted at a polling station in Bayswater. She voted for the coalition Liberal candidate of her constituency on the recommendation of Christabel, who was running as a coalition unionist candidate at Smethwick in the same election. Christabel was narrowly defeated. The victory was partial. 2/3 of British women were now enfranchised. 1/3, the youngest, the propertyless, the most working class, were not. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 had given the vote to almost every adult man in the country, and to a majority, but not the entirety of adult women. Mrs. Pankhurst spoke at a victory dinner at the Connaught Rooms in London on the night of the 7th of February 1918. She told the audience that the cause was substantially won. She told them that the remaining 1/3 would follow within 10 years. She told them that the militant campaign had been suspended in 1914 and would not be resumed. She told them that the union itself would be wound up. The Women's Social and Political Union dissolved itself by formal resolution of its members at a meeting in Holland Park on the 20th of November 1918. The newspaper Britannia ceased publication. The headquarters at Clement's Inn were vacated. The bodyguard, after a final dinner at the Eustace Miles restaurant, dispersed. She was 60 years old. She had no money. She had no organisation. Her 3 living daughters were estranged from her in degrees of severity. She had achieved approximately 2/3 of the political objective for which she had given her life. She did not know what came next. Chapter 11. The Whitechapel Candidate. Nobody expected. She was 60 when she sailed to Canada to lecture on hygiene, and her grand purpose had been replaced with the small loneliness of a paid speaker. The years between 1918 and 1925 were her diaspora years. She had no organisation. She had no income. She had no household of her own. The instrument she had built for the conduct of her life's work had been dissolved by her own hand. She had to live. She accepted in early 1919 a paid lecturing contract from the National Council for Combating Venereal Disease, a Canadian public health body based in Toronto. The contract paid her a salary of approximately $500 per month and required her to undertake a lecture tour of Canadian cities on the subject of public hygiene, the prevention of venereal disease among returning soldiers, and the social purity movement. She sailed for Halifax in March 1919. She remained in Canada for 6 years. The lecture tour was, by her own private description, weary work. She travelled by train across the Canadian provinces, addressing audiences of 200 and 300 in church halls, women's institutes, and YMCA meeting rooms. She spoke about chlamydia, syphilis, and gonorrhea in clinical Edwardian language to audiences of small-town Canadian women who treated her as a returning Empire heroine. She found the work necessary, financially essential, and slowly diminishing. She wrote to her sister Mary in October 1922 that she had not seen the inside of a House of Parliament for almost 4 years and missed the smell of the lobby. She established residence in a small flat in Toronto. She formally became a Canadian resident in 1920. She legally adopted 4 orphaned female babies between 1919 and 1920. The babies were the children of First World War servicemen whose mothers had died in the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919. She gave them the names Catherine, Mary, Joan, and Elizabeth. She raised them in Toronto with the help of a paid nurse and the financial support of a small circle of Canadian benefactors. The adoption record listed her at the time as a 62-year-old widow of independent means. None of the 4 girls remained close to her in adulthood. The 2 surviving children disappeared from the public record in the 1930s. In 1925, she returned to England with the 4 girls. The girls were settled with foster families in the south of England. She moved into a small flat in West Hampstead. She was in financial difficulty. She accepted in 1926 the post of organiser for the Save the Children Fund. The post paid little. She supplemented her income by writing for the Daily Mail. In late 1926, she was approached by the Conservative member for Whitechapel and St George's, Sir Henry Slessor, to consider standing as the Conservative candidate for the constituency at the next general election. Whitechapel and St George's was a working-class East End seat of approximately 20,000 electors that the Conservative Party had not held since the 1906 general election and had no realistic prospect of winning. The candidacy was offered to her as a public honour rather than as a realistic political opportunity. She accepted. The decision astonished many of her former colleagues. The Daily Herald, the Labour newspaper, called the decision a betrayal of working-class women. Sylvia, in a public letter to the editor of the Daily News on the 2nd of February 1927, said that her mother had ended her life in the wrong political party. The decision was made nonetheless. She was formally adopted as the Conservative candidate for Whitechapel and St George's on the 7th of February 1927. She campaigned in Whitechapel for the remainder of the year. She held weekly meetings at the Toynbee Hall in Commercial Street. She walked the streets of Spitalfields and Stepney in her now elderly form. She wore the same black dresses she had worn at the Royal Albert Hall in 1908. She told the audiences at Toynbee Hall, in plain prose, that the working-class women of the East End would be better served by a Conservative party that protected the home than by a Labour party that abolished it. The audiences were polite. The campaign was futile. Her health collapsed in the early months of 1928. She had been suffering from a recurring stomach condition since the hunger strikes of 1913. She had a chronic anemia. She had a recurring chest infection. In April 1928, her condition was diagnosed by Dr. Catherine Pine as septicemia, originating in a chronic infection of the gums dating from the forcible feeding of 1912. She was admitted to a small private nursing home at 50 Wimpole Street in Marylebone in May 1928. The candidacy was withdrawn. The Equal Franchise Bill, the bill that would extend the vote to every woman over 21 on the same terms as men, was passing through the House of Commons in the same weeks that she lay in the nursing home. She was told of its passage by Christabel, who attended her at her bedside. She was 69 years old. She had not eaten solid food for 3 weeks. She wept on the morning she was told the second reading had passed without division. She lingered through the early days of June. She moved in early June to a smaller nursing home in Hampstead under the care of Dr. Pine. She slept most of the time. She was visited by Christabel, by her surviving sisters, and by Annie Kenny. She was not visited by Sylvia. She was not visited by Adela. She died on the 14th of June, 1928, at 25 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. The cause of death was recorded as septicemia of the gums. The certificate was signed by Dr. Catherine Pine. Chapter 12. 18 days from the door. She opened. She died at the Hampstead Nursing Home on the 14th of June 1928, 18 days before every woman in Britain became her equal in the eyes of the law. The Equal Franchise Act received the royal assent on the 2nd of July 1928, 18 days after her death. The Act extended the parliamentary franchise to every woman over the age of 21 on the same terms as men. 15 million women became eligible to vote. The work of her life was finished. She did not live to know that it was finished. She knew, on her last morning, only that the second reading of the bill had passed. Her funeral was held at St. John the Evangelist Church in Smith Square, Westminster, on the 18th of June, 1928. The mourners filled the church. They included Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, who had been a junior minister at the time of the Cat and Mouse Act. They included Lord Birkenhead, the Lord Chancellor, who had been Attorney General at the time of her Old Bailey trial. They included Christabel, who travelled from her American home to bury her mother. They did not include Sylvia. They did not include Adela. The procession to Brompton Cemetery in West London passed through Belgravia and Knightsbridge. Crowds lined the route in a quiet silence. A guard of honour of 50 women, each wearing the colours of the WSPU and carrying small banners, walked behind the hearse. Many of the women had been imprisoned in 1913 and 1914. Some of the men who lined the route had been on the Walton Heath Golf Club Committee in 1913. She was buried in Plot Z 10277 of Brompton Cemetery, in the working class section near the western boundary. The grave is marked by a simple Celtic cross of grey granite. The inscription gives her name, her dates, and a single line of biblical reference from the Gospel of Mark. There is no mention of the cause she gave her life to. The decision on the inscription was Christabel's. The wish, Christabel said in a letter to the Manchester Guardian 3 days after the funeral, was that her mother should be remembered as a woman first. The bronze statue at Victoria Tower Gardens by Arthur George Walker was unveiled on the 6th of March 1930 by Stanley Baldwin in his second period as Prime Minister. The unveiling was attended by Christabel, by a large contingent of former WSPU members, and by a brass band that played the suffragette anthem March of the Women, composed by Ethel Smith. Stanley Baldwin's address, drafted by his cabinet secretary, lasted 12 minutes. He told the audience that Mrs. Pankhurst's victory had been the necessary correction of an old injustice, that the British Constitution had been completed by her work, and that her achievement was now to be regarded as part of the nation's history. A second statue, larger than the original, was added to the original column in 1959. The second statue depicts Christabel Pankhurst in her Edwardian robes. The two figures stand facing the Houses of Parliament, mother and daughter, on the southwest corner of the building they had made tremble. The Manchester statue, Our Emmeline by Hazel Reeves, was unveiled in St. Peter's Square in front of Manchester Central Library on the 14th of December 2018. The date was the centenary of the first general election in which women had voted. The statue depicts Mrs. Pankhurst standing on a chair, as she had stood on a chair in her own parlour at 62 Nelson Street in 1903 to address her 7 first colleagues. The statue was unveiled by her granddaughter Helen Pankhurst. The Pankhurst Centre at 62. Nelson Street, Manchester, the founding parlour of the Women's Social and Political Union, opened as a museum in 1987 on the centenary of the founding. It reopened after refurbishment in 2018 on the centenary of the first women's vote. The parlour has been restored to its 1898 appearance. The fireplace and the marble surround are the original. The carpet is a reproduction. The writing table at which she stood to address her colleagues survives in the museum. The deeper truth her life reveals is the strange relationship in the British Constitution between architecture and political power. The British political system she fought was not abstract. It was a building. It was the Palace of Westminster, the lobby, the chamber, the tower. It was the great houses of the political class that surrounded the seat of government, the country houses where decisions were taken before they reached the cabinet table, where the heirs of empire were raised, where the Constitution was held in its visible body. The franchise was the password into the building. Without the password, no woman could enter. The building decided everything that mattered. Her contribution to the story of Grandeur was to see this with full clarity. Her campaign of fire was not vandalism. It was a strategic communication that the buildings the British political class believed to be permanent could be burned, in their absence, by women who had not been invited inside. The cabinet country houses of 1913 and 1914 were not destroyed in vast numbers. She succeeded only in damaging a small fraction of her targets. The shock to the propertied imagination of the political class was, however, disproportionate. From 1913 onwards, the great house in England held within itself the consciousness that it might be burned by an unarmed woman with a candle stub and a tin of paraffin. The Equal Franchise Act of 1928, passed 18 days after her death, opened the door of the building. It did not preserve the buildings themselves. The great wave of country house demolitions of the next 40 years, the loss of one English country house every 5 days at its peak in the mid-1950s, the conversion of the great estates to schools and hotels and National Trust visitor attractions, the slow erasure of the entire Edwardian landscape of power came too quickly for the architectural permanence of her enemies to survive the changes she had set in motion. The grandeur was lost, not because she burned it, but because the political nation it represented could no longer afford it once the political nation included those who had been kept outside. In this, her victory and the lost grandeur of Edwardian England are one and the same victory, seen from opposite sides. If a single sentence of her life remains in the British memory, it is the one she spoke at the Royal Albert Hall on the 17th of October 1912. I incite this meeting to rebellion. The cabinet of the British government did not, in 1912, take her seriously. The buildings of the British nation did. By the time the British government took her seriously, the buildings had already begun to fall. She had broken into a building. The building she broke into could no longer afford to stand. If you have stayed with me to the end of her life, please subscribe so you do not miss the next story in this series. Tell me in a comment where you are watching from and which moment in the life of Emmeline Pankhurst struck you most sharply, whether the parlour at 62 Nelson Street, the morning at Walton Heath,